welcome to the Beyond Seattle SRE Meetup, November edition. A really exciting event today. We have some great speakers and a couple announcements that I'm pretty stoked about. Going to take this meetup to the next level. So I'm going to get started here. I'm Kit Merker. I'm sort of the, I guess you could say, founder of this meetup group, but really happy to have all the folks here. I work at Noble9. We're a service level objective platform. If you want to know more about service level objectives, I'm happy to talk about it anytime. Follow me on Twitter or find me in the Slack. We have a YouTube channel. All the previous meetups, we publish them when we remember to record. This one we're remembering to record, so that's good. Check us out on the Noble9 YouTube channel. You can watch some previous videos with people who are actually in this meetup right now, which is awesome. And if you're interested in speaking, you can talk to some of the organizers about that. This will be published there, so you may even be watching this on the YouTube right now. One big announcement is we have a new group of leaders, co-organizers, the planning committee for this meetup. We've taken it, I think, to the next level, and I'm just really excited for everybody. Steph Hippo, Dylan Zare, Jolene Kidney, Kevin Schmidt, Tim Johns, you're all on here, yes? And you got your cameras on. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything. Steph's gonna have plenty of time to talk. Let's see, if anybody wants to say anything about the meetup group while you're here, anything, I'd be happy to let you talk for a minute. We obviously planned this ahead very well.
I'll just say that I've been here since the first one that was actually in person, and then we had to move to online, obviously, back in March. And so I found not only presentations very useful for our organization as we are continuing our journey with SRE, but I also find the discussion at the end really helpful. Good time to ask some specific questions about how it might apply to where you're at.
Thanks, Jolene. And that's a great plug for sticking around to the end. We'll talk about that in just a second. I'll keep moving here, but thank you to the organizers. They're going to be helping us find better speakers or different speakers, expand our reach here, come up with new and creative ideas. I know there's a few plans in the works already for things like mentoring groups and things like that. So a lot of really exciting stuff going to be happening in 2021. If you haven't already, you can join the Beyond Seattle SRE Meetup Slack, brand new. We just kicked it off, and we're now going to try to have conversations happening in between the meetups. This is a big piece of feedback from everybody, was they wanted more of a connection to the community. Slack is a great tool for it. Most of us are using it day in and day out at work anyway. So we'll all be there kind of hanging out, moderating, etc. We have a new jobs channel that we've created. There'll be other channels created there as well. So get on the Meetup Slack. All right. And just a quick agenda. We're doing the welcome right now. And in a moment, I'm going to hand off to Corey Innis from VMware, who's going to talk about shifting left and reliability. And I think this is going to be a very cool talk, digging into the whole kind of observability-driven development, which reminds me of test-driven development a little bit. Maybe there'll be a connection there. As always, we're going to do our breakout networking groups, which is always super fun. Urza has picked some work from home appropriate questions for the breakouts. We'll explain that in a little bit, but basically everybody's going to get a chance to chat with a small group of people, introduce yourself and answer an icebreaker. It's pretty fun. And then we'll all come back to the main room, and Steph Hippo will take over, and she's going to talk about building SRE teams in startup environment. This is a question a lot of people have been asking about. Hey, we're not Google. How do we do SRE? We've had talks about this topic in the past several times. Really great one. I'm looking forward to Steph's take on it. I'm going to make a few more announcements at the end about some upcoming stuff. We'll go into the Q&A session, and then we'll say goodbye. So we're going to keep it short and sweet today. We've cut the length of the talks. We've cut the length of the meetup based on feedback. Hopefully you can stay attentive the whole time. So thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Corey Innis.
Great, thanks, Kit. You seen my shift left on reliability slide okay? Yep, thumbs up. Cool. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. We're going to talk about shift left on reliability today, and in particular, an aspect of getting started with observability-driven development. What do we mean by observability-driven development? How would we get started? And how does this relate to shifting left on reliability? What does that even mean? Briefly, a bit about myself. I'm Corey. You can find me at Corey TI on basically every social network kind of thing. I have been, played a large number of roles from application development. I started out as a web designer. I've been in operations, sysadmin in the last few years in the reliability engineering space. I'm now part of the VMware customer reliability engineering team. I will say I'm not here representing VMware in any way. These are my thoughts. Hopefully, they agree as well, but I'm here representing myself for the moment. And I've worked over the course of these couple decades with teams from like a one developer startup team to have customers who have 30 or 40,000 engineers in big enterprise as well. And I'm excited to hear Steph's talk following this because it's very clear to me that these practices and principles, you might dial things up or down, but they apply to any kind of organization of any size. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by observability-driven development in this context. So starting with observability, I'm going to repeat what so many people have shared and really resonates for me. Observability is a measure of how well internal states of a system can be inferred from knowledge of its external outputs. This is a definition from Wikipedia. This is something that folks like Charity Majors and so forth will turn to quite a lot and refer to quite a lot. And there's some, kind of debate around, as I think most folks here are aware, there's debate around what we mean by observability. In some cases, it sounds like what we refer to actually still as monitoring, some monitoring 2.0 or something like that. And I really I would align myself with this perspective, this kind of description of observability as this measure. In particular, the measure part is what stands out for me. It is an attribute. The observability is an addressable and adjustable characteristic of that your systems possess. This is something that that you can and should improve over time. So let's dig into this next bit here. What are we talking about when we're referring to the driven aspect of observability-driven development? This is something where I'm going to lean on Charity Majors a lot here for this talk and various points. Charity refers to or describes observability-driven development in many cases as the interrogation, looking at your testing in production, looking at things as they are in production, and learning from that and influencing then your development of your product. And I think that's really valuable. I like that a lot. For the sake of this talk, I want to maybe reframe things a little bit and consider that observation-driven development or interrogation-driven development. For the sake of this talk, I want to think of observability-driven development as going back to that aspect of a measure, some attribute of your system. Observability is something that you can drive, that you can increase and use to drive the quality of your product. So not necessarily the observing, but the capability to observe. And to Kit's point earlier, I think that in this way, there is some great analogous setup to test-driven development. We'll get into that in a moment. So unit test-driven development, in particular, let's say unit tests. What I want to express here to start with is there's a great talk I I reviewed lately, or sorry, recently, about how we've kind of drifted away from the original intent of test-driven development from Kent Beck and the like, to the point where, often now we consider like unit tests, for example, as something that's going to test some method or some class, and that, if we can't easily get our hands around that method, then let's make it public so we can test it. And that was not really the original intention or intent for test-driven development. The intent the unit is your public API or your module or your surface, the thing that you're, providing to your consumer. And that could be, this class or a method or so forth is an implementation detail. So the key point that I think is really valuable to that reframing, if we get back to original framing of test-driven development, is that you're framing around what's important around system boundaries. And similarly, in the interest of driving observability and having observability drive your product, we're going to start talking about getting started, and those system boundaries, those public APIs, those module interfaces, those surfaces are what I'd suggest are the places to get started. So to summarize that, and this is something that, again, leaning on Charity some, you can summarize this as like test behaviors, not implementations. And that's true for whether you're talking about TDD or observability-driven development. So following that framing, getting started with observability-driven development, what we're talking about is you want to be adding observability first. And when I'm talking about test-driven development, we're talking about test first driving. So we write the test, you see the test fail, you write the code to pass the test, you refactor your code to improve it. Similarly, I believe we ought to be incorporating that same kind of practice in with regard to observability. When we're writing our code, we should be adding the capability, considering the capability at that point in time around like what do I need to do to make sure that this is more observable, more reliable, or I can check on the reliability of it. Similarly, like to TDD, we want to commit observability as code with the code base that it's related to. And again, start with the public services. This incidentally plays very well with the idea that service level indicators and service level objectives are about user experience and expectation and satisfaction. If you're focusing first on what matters most to your users and to your business value, these are the seams, the system boundaries, the key integration points between components in your system. And these are good places to start getting your observability built up. And observe, the key point going back to the like Charity's existing definitions. Interrogate your system, learn from it, go check things out in production, and bring that back into your design and development. So the key part here is the as code part, right? As with TDD, wherein the testing is not some separate process that's performed later by some other team, a QA team, for example, but rather an integral part of the development cycle, and indeed an integral part of the code base, committed generally side by side. Adding great observability, increasing the observability score, let's say, of your system should be a part of the development workflow and should be committed. We should have like infrastructure as code, configuration as code, et cetera. We should have observability as code as part of our repositories. And like TDD, these are going to lead, like the great outcomes here are things like a sense of satisfaction. One of the things I love in writing tests first for a unit test or an integration test is there becomes a point at which I know I am satisfied that I'm done. right? I've got some tests I've thoughtfully put together. I'm writing some code. Maybe I've got to adjust some other code to make that work. And at some point I can say, ah, I'm done. I know this because my test told me so. And we can have a similar sense of satisfaction with observability, greatly integrated into our systems and our tools, to help us know that, say, when we're shipping to production, I can be satisfied. I can have a sense of satisfaction that I know that I'm shipping something that works as expected. Similarly, confidence. So the confidence in this regard for TDD might be related to refactoring, and that is, to harp on this a little bit, I think the term's used a lot by all of us these days, but given the same contract, the same inputs should result in the same outputs and side effects. So this is not a redesign or something. This is like improving code so it's more understandable or more maintainable, something like that, but it has the same results. And I can change that code with confidence. I can refactor it with confidence because my test suite that's in place, that's part of my code base, is letting me know that I'm in good shape, and observability can do the same kind of thing. Maybe more importantly are things like shared understanding and shared ownership. These are the kinds of things that help me more easily tell you, my consumer, what I mean by the health of the system or the running of the system, and enable you to query it to come to understand, gain greater insights into how the thing you're consuming is working. So why do we care about all this? To start with, I'll go back and say, because charity says so. And seriously, I'd say, like, if I'm sure a lot of people here read Charity Major's content. If you don't, or you do read more of it, it's just like there's magic in there. In particular, a couple of things I want to call out are, she'll say that observability gives you the power to ask new questions of your system without having to ship new code. A lot of us probably have heard this or read this. Without having to ship new code in order to ask those new questions. And further, like getting the right information at the right time into the hands of the people who have the ability and responsibility to do the right thing. So this might be, this is why we should care about observability more broadly. That second point there, like getting the right information into the right time, at the right time, into the hands of the people who have the ability and responsibility to do the right thing, I think starts to get at the driven development part, the observability-driven development, where like the transition from traditional QA to test-driven development, we're shifting some of the responsibility of adding these capabilities to your system to the people who know most about how to do so, who know most about the running of the code, the running of that service, the running of the system, which isn't to say that people in the QA space or people in the operations traditionally space don't have valuable insights. This gets jumping ahead a little at the shift left. We want to bring them along, right? So the QA role might have gone away in some organizations, but the quality engineering expertise has not gone away, and those folks actually can help with the software development engineering upfront a bit more. Additionally, why? The 4 keys. So many folks here probably familiar with the DORA DevOps research and assessment team, who are now part of Google, and have been for 6 years now doing a very scientific method-based set of research around DevOps, around lean UX, lean product, and really fundamentally around what we can call site reliability engineering as well. And they've identified these 4 key metrics that are key, that indicate the performance of software development teams and IT organizations. These are the 4 things that distinguish low from medium from high from elite performers. And those are the lead time for change. That is the time it takes, for example, the time it takes between code commit and code going to production. This could also be the time between like a library you consume becoming available and you actually pulling it in to consume in your product. The next is deployment frequency, how often an organization successfully releases to production. And the idea here is, greater frequency is better, safer, a key to success. The change fail rate as a percentage of deployments that cause a failure in production. And the time to restore service, how long it takes for an organization to recover from a failure in production. Similarly, I'll pause here for a moment. Reliability, if we accept that reliability is something that's defined really by user experience and expectation and perception, another very closely related thing to the mean time to restore and something to consider throughout the rest of this talk is something like mean time to mitigation. If we can get more quickly to a state at which our customers, our end users perceive things to be working fine, then they perceive our service to be more reliable, and that's a win. So we have these 4 keys to consider, and let's transition now to this notion of shifting left on. And the idea to keep in mind as we go here is I would suggest that the earlier that we can incorporate the capabilities for us to, let me back up actually a moment. So if we incorporate better observability into our service early on, that in turn addresses all 4 of these points. We can, clearly, like if we're have a good sense that our code is working as expected, not just in terms of logically from unit tests, but in terms of like the reliability, the availability of it, we're going to see fewer change failures in production. The rest of these can be addressed as well. If mean time to restore, I think, is another one that's really clear here, right? If I have the tooling in terms of observability that lets me query, interrogate my system with arbitrary questions without having to deploy updates in order to answer those questions, my time to mitigation and my time to restore is going to go down. So we're addressing these key aspects there. So shift left on X, what do we mean by shift left? A lot of folks are maybe familiar with this. I often describe this in terms as related to shift left on security, and to summarize that, I think of that as like if I'm building, let's say an API is my product and I'm adding a new endpoint to my API, at the time that I am designing and building that endpoint is when I should be considering about the potential security implications and ensuring that I'm either guarding against those or building some tooling to help investigate what's going on in case I have some concern. And similarly, to the QA story earlier, shift left on testing could be moving a lot of the testing activity upfront into earlier in the product development lifecycle. And so what I'd say is like, in the first case, we're talking about build it earlier, build it with the people who know. This is, very similar to like the DevOps idea of not throwing your code over the wall to operators, but shifting the expertise upfront into the development workflow and getting everyone in the room who knows how to improve how we build this thing. Again, like a quick aside, this does not, removing a role, I talk about QA in this case, does not mean translate to losing a job. The capabilities are still needed. We're talking about, I wish I had this slide, I meant to draw this up, but if there's like this string of people in the pipeline delivering from the product design to it being in production, we're talking, the shifting left is not just taking those that expertise on its own and making people on the left side know about it. You're bringing bringing the team closer together. And one way to frame this, you might think of a balanced team, like product management, QA, developers, security people are working more closely together. So, and really what we're talking about then on shift left on X is like make X a practice instead of a role. Okay, another, but why? Well, in this case, it's because Alex Hidalgo says so. Alex has this great quote from the Implementing Service Level Objectives book. All the theory, philosophy, and approaches in that book really only exist to make people's lives easier and therefore hopefully better. And this really, resonates a lot for me, and I think is, really what we're trying to get at here is like making experiences, making lives better. And part of how we do that is like by bringing people together, bringing practices together, bringing thought together, and not having as much like big back and forth. So let's start to talk about some tools and techniques here. You might be asking, I'm not sure, certainly along the way, I started asking myself, like, this is what I thought this getting started talk would be about. And that was my initial intention, to be more sort of a demonstration of some actual code, some config implementation, maybe looking at some pipelines and so forth. And I have spent a fair bit of time recently building up that an environment and a code base to serve that purpose. I'm excited to continue with that, and we'll find some way to maybe through the Slack channel share this with folks as I'm building it up. I really want to have like something we can collaborate on to express these things and put them into practice, turn the theory into practice. That said, along the way, I came to realize that I didn't feel I would didn't have any degree of confidence that I would be able to build something that I could turn into a 20-minute talk that was actually illustrating these points. So for the sake of this presentation, this talk today, the getting started is, about like how do we start thinking about this, and where should we start, adopting these practices and adapting them and adjusting how we're working. So we'll come back to some actual code another time. That said, here are some initial possibilities, some things to consider for the services you're building. And these are the spaces that I'm exploring in the code base and the environment that I want to bring up. So for example, proxies and sidecars. So let me pause here for a moment. Part of the point of this is like, in the interest of getting started, we want to unblock ourselves and not have it be too great of a hurdle to overcome in order to start seeing the benefit of having observability baked into our code base and our systems. And so while we know that there's great code instrumentation possibilities out there from open telemetry, open tracing, open census, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are agents that we can install that are going to help get us a long way for a lot of things. I think some additional aspects, some additional possibilities to consider that say don't necessarily require some code change might be something like proxies and sidecars. So if you're sending all of your traffic through something and you can instrument that sidecar, for example, to be measuring the latency and the success or failure and the throughput, and the sidecar is publishing to your, making available to your observability system or your users the ability to query, that can be a great way to get started without actually having to change your running code. Build packs are something folks may or may not be familiar with, but the idea that your developers are defining, like writing software, and either by introspection or by some configuration that can define the environment under which it should run. And maybe if you have a separate operator who's providing that environment, they could specify that every application unit that's going to be installed will have this additional capability installed next to it. So sort of maybe build packs, for example, is one of the ways I'm exploring having the sidecar be installed and enabled. And then really what I think gets more interesting is starting to think about how do we plug these into our delivery, right? So if we, to oversimplify things, think of the outputs from test-driven development, unit tests, integration tests, acceptance tests, et cetera, as being something that goes into our continuous integration pipeline and therefore fails the delivery of the software, the release publishing of the software if something logically fails. We can incorporate observability-driven development, the outputs, the artifacts of observability-driven development into our continuous deployment or continuous delivery pipelines. So for example, you might have, your CI pipeline passes, your CD pipeline kicks off. Maybe one step in your pipeline is to deploy to a 1% or 10% canary, or to flip a feature flag on some set of your recently updated running software. And then the same monitors and observability capabilities, if you've defined your observability as adjacent side by side with your code, so it's staying in sync with your code, you could use the same tests that are really going to show up on your dashboards and feed into your alerts and so forth as the things that act as gates for that continuous delivery pipeline, and using the production environment as the state to enable that. All right, so one final but why. Reliability is a conversation. This comes from David Blank-Edelman at the start of Alex's book. And so maybe my suggestion here is maybe that it follows that observability is the grammar and the vocabulary. If we're enabling our community, our team to have a better understanding and to have a discourse around the running of our software, observability is what lets us have that in some meaningful way. And I think that's it for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Corey. Great job. That was awesome. Okay, Steph, we'll get it going here. So without further ado, Steph Hippo.
Kit, can you see everything? Okay, just confirm.
I can see your Chrome bar at the top, but other than that.
Great. Let's fix that.
Let's see if you can. There you go. You got it now. Steph Hippo.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, we're going to talk about ways to work towards SRE when you're not global yet. So how do you build up an SRE team when you're still small? So if you haven't met me, I'm Steph. I'm one of the organizers for now Beyond Seattle SRE Meetup. We hosted the first one at Google back in January and in person, and we've been virtual since then, but I'm looking forward to the day when we can have everybody back. But I'm a site reliability manager at Google. I manage teams in Seattle and Munich. I'm a big fan of the Seattle tech community. You may have seen me at Coffee Ops or DevOps Days Seattle. I'm probably going to tell you to look at your SLOs, and if you follow me on Twitter, you'll probably recognize my dog, but back when offices were a thing, he was a big fan of being able to come to the office with me. So this topic has been popular at meetups because it comes up at meetups a lot. And so the general idea is I want my team to practice SRE, but my management team isn't convinced yet. How do I make the case? So when the SRE book came out, we got some feedback that smaller orgs needed more actionable paths to Google's SRE practices. And so the SRE workbook addressed a lot of that, but we're just going to walk through what I think is the most important starter steps today. And so if you think your organization is too far away from truly embracing SRE, maybe you've been told that, it's probably not true. So there are certainly things you can do to start now. And so we'll walk through a couple of those. But this is normally the biggest hurdle, right? So what if you don't have leadership buy-in yet? So sometimes folks want to get management buy-in for an SRE model, they just don't know how. So I think the biggest thing, so my manager always says this, SREs argue with numbers. Businesses are built on numbers, hammer out your costs. Sometimes you're going to need estimates to do that, and that's fine. Just be clear on where those assumptions or estimates are. So some costs to consider. The biggest cost I see ignored, especially in smaller companies, is churn. And I'm not talking about like natural team turnover. It can be really good for folks to change teams, mix different skills, and learn from each other for their own career growth. I'm talking the kind of churn where people are in a revolving door because they're miserable and they're ready to leave your team in a matter of months. That much churn is expensive. You've got to recruit, and then you have to retrain. Recruiting and retraining is, a necessary investment when someone joins. But if you're constantly having to start that cycle over, you're never getting any of the payoff from that upfront cost, and that gets expensive over time. You want to set people up for success long term, so that you can leverage that time that you invested in them at the beginning, and ideally, the longer they're there, the better they can train new people. So it starts to have a compounding effect. So you're wasting time and money if you're just having to recruit and retrain. Great teams build great companies. That starts with getting that bang for your buck out of the ramp up. So figure out what your recruiting costs are. Like what does it cost you to recruit, and what does it cost you to train somebody up to the point where they're an active contributing member of the team. The other big cost is prioritization. So again, SREs, we're going to think in terms of SLOs. I am willing to bet no one's been in an engineering project and said like, gee, wish we had more work to choose from. So even teams that are turning products down normally can't honestly say that. They don't wish they had more work. But SLOs can help you figure out where you need to invest that engineering time, whether that needs to be in feature work to keep your customers happy, or in infrastructure work to keep it reliable so your customers can trust you. From an engineering leadership perspective, those are all good reasons to prioritize reliability and reduce toil. But product leadership should care about this too. Like this should be a whole organization kind of deal. And the biggest reason is feature delivery. And so sometimes this sounds counterintuitive, but I think there was a great Dora report on this. Keeping your engineering team releasing faster is a key part of feature delivery. So the faster you can ship, the faster you can roll back, and the more reliable you can stay. But if your team never gets time to improve that infrastructure, they're going to be addressing that on-call load. They're going to be spending time keeping your service just alive for customers. And that is going to take away from the time you have for feature delivery. And, we all want to tell customers, yes, customers pay us money that lets us write checks to people, that lets us keep our business going. But sometimes it's better to tell a customer later rather than like, yes, right now, and then fail to deliver. Because when you fail to deliver on something that's not going, or if you do deliver on something that's not going to be available to the level that somebody needs to trust and depend on it, that's going to wear away at your user trust really fast. And user trust is going to directly translate to dollars that customers are willing to spend. So even though it might feel good to make people happy, that's like a normal emotional response to enjoy making people happy. SLOs in your organization can help you figure out how risky is this bet that you're making that you can deliver on for this feature for your customer versus where is it in your business's best long-term interest to slow down. So you can build the coolest feature ever, but if it's not available and no customers are going to get to use it or fall in love with it, is it really helping you? So this brings me to, I think the most important part is your reputation building. There are network effects for successful software tools, and people will know if your incidents start adding up over time, especially if there's a trend that they don't feel like you're addressing. And so if you want to build that software trust, you need to keep that in mind from the beginning. And that when you are getting pressure from customers for these features, this SLO model can help you talk to them a little bit about, not just managing expectations, but knowing that if you do commit to something, you will deliver on it. So my main advice to leaders throughout an organization is, please assume that your product will be a wild success. Assume that it will need to be maintained. Assume that you will have to adjust for rapid customer growth. What decisions are you making now that are going to keep you most successful year after year? I'm sure the next shiny thing is going to make a big splash, but you need to make sure that as you accumulate these things, you're building a strong building. So SLOs, I know it's like a running joke that all SRE talks are really just SLO talks, and this one is too, but there's good reason for that. So consider the trade-offs. that you can make when in different parts of the organization when you're talking about SLOs. Getting folks to collaborate is also a great way to, getting folks to collaborate on SLOs is a great way to work your way up to truly embracing and running SRE. So, you know, tell leadership that they need to enforce these. And so if leadership's going to enforce these, they should probably be involved in helping to set them. For sales, this can be a really great competitive advantage. And like, does your competitor product have an SLO? They're just a really crisp way to express what the product provides to customers and be able to compare across platforms. This will be a great starting point for them to help customers understand like what they're actually getting for their money. Engineering knows it's going to help them prioritize their work and align it with leadership and sales. Engineering gets frustrated if they're building things that, you know, nobody wants or no one's enjoying, like they want work that matters. And so SLOs can be a great way to show them like, this is how you're helping us meet our SLOs, and or this is how we know that we can put out more features because our SLOs are good. UX, user experience, if you have it, I think they can be a game changer in SLOs, but SLOs can also help them pin down critical user journeys that you need to focus on or work on. So really everyone here can benefit from the SLO discussion. SLOs are not going to show immediate value the next day, but give it some time. The first SLO you said is probably wrong, but you know, iterating on that and driving those conversations within your organization, that's what's going to lead to the value and the change. So this is from the SRE workbook, and it is one of the quotes that makes me saddest. So our on-call engineer gets paged about 100 times in a typical 24-hour shift. A lot of pages get ignored while the real problems are buried under the pile. Where should we start? So this is the first actionable step you can take towards getting your company towards SRE, even if you're still waiting for that leadership buy-in. What are some things that you can do today to get your pager healthy, and what does healthy mean anyway? So these are some key things to look for. The first is rotation size. So if you're in an on-call rotation, how long can you actually sustain a 24/7 on-call rotation? The SRE book, I think, recommends 6 folks if you're doing follow the sun, but if you're singly homed, at least 8. So if your team's not large enough to really support that yet, think about why Google does follow the sun. Even if you can't do it. And the why behind it is because we want to take care of our people. So people that don't get paged overnight all week are happier in their roles. They're less stressed. They're more focused during the day. Those are all good things. So if you can avoid a 24/7 on call, do. But if your SLOs necessitate it, like you need to do it. But it's not about getting you know, the fastest time to keyboard and the tightest SLO with the most on call coverage. You need to do what's right for your product. That might mean 24/7 on call, but I wouldn't operate on that as an assumption. So your goal is to get what your team needs. So if, again, if you're small, consider if you can ask other teams to share the on-call load. I really recommend keeping some of the developer org in your on-call rotation. If you're still really small, pull leadership in. Make sure that they understand, you know, the pain that folks might be feeling on call. Pick reasonable handoff schedules. You also don't have to do 24/7. You don't need to do on call a week at a time. Talk to your team, take a temperature check, see if it's easier to alternate shifts of 3 days and 4 days, if that allows more frequent breaks for people. If you are doing handoffs, like don't hand off at 6 a.m. if you know most of your developers aren't up yet, like wait for a time where you can do a reasonable handoff. I've seen some teams just inherit their handoff times and never really check in to see if that was still working for them. So talk to your team, ask them about their on-call rotations, and figure out what's healthier. Okay, this brings us to OpsReview. This is all about how you learn from your on-call. So that quote earlier said something like 100 pages in 24 hours. That's terrible. Weed out your bad alerts that aren't adding value to your product. So if it's just raising your on-call stress level to be getting paged and you can't do anything actionable for the pages, stop doing that. If you're seeing something like 100, rather than weeding, just start over. Shut off all of your alerts and then work on tuning your alerts or improving your product until you can depend on those alerts being actionable, so that you're not stressing out on call. And if they are getting paged, you can actually do something. It's really frustrating to get paged and, you know, it's either resolved by the time you check or there's nothing actionable you can do. So after you weed out your bad alerts, you make them better, look out for tipping points. So I used to work in a product. This was before I was a Google SRE. We weren't an SRE team, but we were starting to adopt similar things, a DevOps model kind of idea. But there was an alert that would go off at 6 a.m. every day. And it turned out it would do that when the pipeline that kicked off at 6 added extra load. And so we eventually took a look at that and one, tuned the alert, but two, made sure that when that load was kicking off, we weren't actually damaging the rest of our user experience, even if we didn't think we might have many users on at 6 a.m. But we were able to discuss that because we were looking at our alerts together. And then every week, my current team is asked, like, what needs a postmortem? We go through our alerts. And I like making engineers write things down because it forces them to think the whole way through the problem and make sure it gets shared with the rest of the team. So we regularly go through our alerts and say, like, what needs a postmortem? Was there anything that was particularly painful or needs a deeper dive? Was there anything sufficiently weird? We have a lot of smart folks that, we pay to take care of these systems. They know their stuff. If they think it's weird, it's probably because it's weird. So let's look into how to make that simpler. And we'll normally start by writing a postmortem. As I mentioned earlier, keep different job functions involved in this. If you do write a postmortem for something, share it out to the rest of the company. It can be really helpful for sales to understand, like, what are we doing so this doesn't happen again? This gives them talking points to customers. It helps leadership see where you need to prioritize. So not only is it a good collaboration and learning tool, but can also be good to use for prioritization and messaging. Okay, this is the if you only take one thing today. Please don't be a hero on call. If you are being put through a meat grinder, stop. Don't wait until you burn out. Tell management if it's not sustainable, because if you're acting like everything is fine when it's not, that's going to impact management's prioritization and your situation will not get better. So don't hide the problems just by thinking, well, I can tough it out on my 4th 3 a.m. page of the week. Speak up and say, like, hey, this isn't acceptable. Like, we need to do something. What's the plan? Or pitch the plan. But don't just keep taking the hits because if management thinks it's okay, it's gonna stay that way. So from the SRE workbook, we have a high turnover rate for on-call rotations. How do you address the knowledge gap within the team? So again, big part of DevOps is knowledge sharing. SRE is just one way to implement this. These are some of my recommendations. So make sure you have like an on-call curriculum training, like write it down, share it, have other people weigh in on it. No one's ever fully prepared for on-call the first time, but ample training will make it less stressful. I remember my mentor telling me, eventually the pager will stop causing an adrenaline rush and you'll just be fine. I was just still so terrified of the pager at the time, I couldn't believe him, but turns out Christopher's right. And so, helping communicate those expectations of what's, what it might feel like for new team members can also help folks get more comfortable with on-call. I also recommend communicating expectations again to the rest of the org. SRE is multidisciplinary. When I'm solving an incident, I don't want very well-intended comments from sales, saying like, hey, this is impacted, like, we know we're on it, please refer to our, whatever our incident communication tool is and follow along there so that I can focus on doing my job. But if folks don't know about that and they're trying to be helpful, then they might come in and, paying things like that. I recommend AMAs. This was the best thing my mentor ever did for me. When I joined the team, he set up Ask Me Anything sessions a couple times a week where I could ask about the system. And if I was too afraid to ask anything, he would just pick a topic and keep going until I felt comfortable bringing questions. It made a huge difference in my psychological safety on the team, knowing that I was allowed to ask about these things and that it was encouraged. On that note, blamelessness, postmortems, again, you hire smart people to be these engineers. They're still going to make mistakes. They're human. It's not a matter of if, it's when. They're already going to feel bad about it, so you don't need to worry about that. But focus on your systems instead and talk about how did our systems let something like this get through? Maybe this should have been caught in code review. Maybe the system should have double checked that our parameters made sense, things like that. Again, big fan of postmortems, sharing them. Postmortems can also be a great way for you to model blamelessness. to new team members, if they see how you write, they'll also talk about incidents that way. So just keep in mind, maybe in the moment, sometimes you want to say something to vent or when you're upset, but you have other engineers watching, you're setting the culture. For on-call prep, I really recommend shadowing and reverse shadowing. So in my team's case, if you're new to on-call, you will watch an on-caller for a week just during business hours and see what they do. You can ask questions. The next week, though, you're going to reverse shadow. So you're going to be in the driver's seat again, just during business hours. But there's going to be a senior SRE there, shoulder surfing a little bit, but not to judge, just to help if you get stuck or walk you through some tools that you might not know you have, things like that. And then we're also going to do Wheels of Misfortune with you. So Wheels of Misfortune are where we replay some pages so that you can, in a lower pressure environment, talk through with the team on what you would do in the situation to make sure that folks know. I think this is especially good for critical incidents that hopefully don't happen often. So if you've ever had like a privacy incident or things like that, or maybe data corruption is something that when it hopefully rare, but is extreme, make sure that folks know what they would do in that scenario, even if they haven't seen it themselves before. So my biggest advice for closing that knowledge gap is reduce turnover in the first place. So prioritize a couple of these things to take care of your on-callers. Maybe you're not in a leadership position to authorize some of this, but pitch it to your leadership. So one of the things we do is time off in lieu. It makes a little TOIL acronym. It's very cute. But even if your company can't afford extra bonus money for on-call right now, can you give folks some time off to recover? Because on-call can be really stressful. So maybe they get the Monday after the rotation off, or they can build up extra vacation hour credit to take a couple days at once. I almost always take my on-call comp as vacation, but that lets me take a longer break and actually disconnect from work, decompress, and get ready to go do it all again. If you can't afford it, on-call comp helps. Folks are going to know best what reduces stress for them. Maybe they want to save up money to take that vacation, or they just want to use that money to be able to order out that week so they don't have to worry about dinner or something like that. So I've seen some models where folks only get bonus comp if they get paged, but if they're on-call and you're expecting them to be at a keyboard within 30 minutes or something when they get paged, then you're still infringing on somebody's ability to disconnect. You should find a way to compensate and make up for that. The biggest important thing is agency. If you're a leader, making sure you are listening to your on-callers. The quickest way to burn out is when you feel like you're shouting into a void and things aren't getting better. So make sure that if they are coming to you, they're raising things in ops review, that work is getting prioritized and you are doing something about it. So that will make them feel heard and part of the solution, and it goes a long way into making them feel that on-call is worth it. Again, you're paying smart people, let them be smart, let them tell you what's up and what needs to happen. Make sure that that pain that they're taking on for you is factored in. Okay, and with that, so these are some of the SRE books that we have. So Site Reliability Engineering is from 2016, I want to say. That was the principles book. I think the workbook came 2 years later. That is the practical ways to implement SRE, which a lot of this talk is from. I also recommend Seeking SRE. I was excited to see David Blank-Edelman in Corey's talk. All really good books, all really actionable. And if you read them, let me know in the Slack and I'll be happy to chat with you there. The Google books are available for free to read online. I believe it's just google.com/SRE. So thanks very much, and I will see you in the Slack.
Thank you, Steph. All right, that was great. Okay, we're going to keep on trucking here. If I can find my slides that I moved. Here we go. Okay, you can see this? All right. Okay, so I have a few announcements to make before we get back to the Q&A. So thanks everybody for sticking with us so long. Okay, our next meetup will be the last one of the year, Wednesday, December 9th. And we're gonna have Layla Sells from Google and Florian Columbell from Dell speaking. And I think we'll be announcing soon exactly what their talks will be about. We're trying to get more information about that earlier so you can decide if it's worth it for you to come, and we hope it will be. But we'll be sharing that soon. So keep an eye out for that in the Slack. And I think Urza will post a link to it in general and probably in the Zoom as well. So you can go ahead and RSVP for that now while you're thinking about it. And tell your friends, if you bring a friend, you get a mug. That's our game. So we also, in between the meetups, we have our Beyond Seattle SRE coffee hours. And this is just basically a one big breakout session. There's no agenda or speakers assigned. It's really just a time to kind of catch up, chat with people. We usually talk about whatever's going on and come up with ideas for talks and things like that. So that's on Friday, December 4th. It's in the morning, 9 a.m. Pacific time. So go ahead and RSVP for that as well if you feel like it. It's a different kind of experience than this, but it's a cool way to connect. And then the Slack group, we mentioned it before. Everybody should have seen that. So if you haven't had a chance to, go ahead and join the Slack group if you'd like, and you can see things there, updates, etc. Ask questions and have conversations. There's also a new jobs channel. You may have noticed we're not doing the rapid round jobs talk that we normally do. We've kind of moved that into Slack, and feel free to post and share about positions or if you're looking, etc. The last thing is, please if you take a second to fill out the survey, we'd appreciate it. We take the feedback very seriously. It's very short, easy questions. You can also have a chance to win implementing service level objectives. I think we'll give away, one or two copies of that at random. And then if you brought a friend or a friend brought you, it's the honor system, but you can order a mug here. Just fill out this form. We'll send you a free official Sip, Relax, Enjoy mug. I have one right here. But go ahead and fill that out if you'd like, and we'll hook you up with that as well. Okay, so that's it for announcements. Now I'm going to invite back to the stage Corey and Steph, and we'll be happy to take some questions. Any questions out there?
I always have questions, but somebody else
Tim,
can go first.
Tim gets the honorary first position. Here we go.
I don't ever like to go first, but I don't like pauses either. I'm one of those.
Yeah, I
people,
know.
I do terrible if there's a pause. But working backwards here a little bit, Steph, a couple things you mentioned really resonated with me. When you were talking about healthy on-call rotations, you said when you're really small, and I've a track record of working for really small organizations. You said to have leadership in your on-call. I'm always on the on-call, and I try to get as much leadership as I can. I think that's tremendously helpful, not just because it gives me visibility into what's going on, but also because it theoretically, and that's getting to the real question here, it's theoretically motivating to other people that would have to be on call as well. And then going to the second part here, you were talking about taking care of your on-callers, and you listed out some really cool tools. I think you said time off, on-call comp, and agency were three. And then, but here's the question I have, and this is kind of subtle. So I've been at all these little organizations that started out with no product, some of them with no idea and no service to run. And every time I've hired early people there, I've been really crystal clear that, yeah, we're going to eventually get to a point where you're going to need to be on call. And these are usually devs. And then when we actually get to that point, that becomes an extremely painful conversation for everybody, even though it's pretty easy. I'm on call. It's pretty easy to remind people that we literally talked about that in our offer, and then offering those tools that you mentioned there. It's still a painful conversation. And that's a very long-winded way of asking. Do you have any tips for actually having that conversation? You gave me some tools, but how about the conversation itself?
Yeah, for sure. So at Google, we talked to you up front. We have a goal of probably 6 months. It depends wildly on like where you're going. Some teams it needs to be a year, and that's okay. But I would recommend having that conversation up front. Like X months in, we expect you to be on call. What my team does, first day you join, you get a calendar invite for 3 months from then, where you're going to start taking some on-call classes. And then at 6 months, that's where we're going to start scheduling your shadows. And then after we see how your shadows go, then we talk about flipping the switch. But just from day one, setting the expectation for when it's going to happen makes it a little harder for people to do the backpedal. And sometimes the backpedal is because they're scared. So again, focusing on that on-call training, letting them know, like, yes, you will be afraid of the pager at first, and I promise you someday there will be a day when you're not. But yeah, those first couple wee-woos are going to send your heart rate through the roof. And sometimes people don't want to admit that they're afraid of that. But yeah, set the expectation from day one, get it on the calendar, get it on the schedule, make them accept, and invest in that on-call training. I think will set you up for the best success as you can. I won't say it'll eliminate everyone's fears completely.
Thanks, that is helpful. I think one of the challenges I have is often when I recruited these early folks, they don't actually believe that there's ever going to be like a service in the world, so they don't think that's going to come up. But that meeting invite, I'm taking that to heart, in the sense that you know, the 6 months or whatever that goes from the time they sign up to the time it actually happens is can be a surprise.
Yeah, I will say also, we call them nooglers, but they're invited to Wheels of Misfortune from the get-go too. So if you're not on call yet and you can't run those, you know, starting to talk about some sort of training to get people in the mindset like, yeah, this is coming, we're getting ready for it.
Anyone else? Other questions?
Corey, I'd be interested just to hear more about the application you were talking about trying to build or share as like an open source project. Yeah.
Oh.
What were you thinking there?
Sure. I'm glad you asked because I'd love to hear what people think. It's still underway. So at the moment, I've been mostly at the focusing a lot around sort of like a Kubernetes space, have a cluster up and running. I also come from the Cloud Foundry background, so out of Pivotal. So Cloud Foundry running on Kubernetes is really attractive to me. That gets at, for example, like the build packs, being able to deliver something that would spin up a sidecar, for example, is something that I think would be really interesting there. And so I'm kind of still in the getting all of the component pieces up and ready, but have been thinking about what would the app be. And it's often when I'm talking to, so there are a few spaces, I'd love to hear what people think. Often when I deliver like SLO, SLI workshops with customers and stuff. And an example I'll use often is like a music streaming service. And, you know, like my experience with Google Play, now YouTube Music, was like, there'll be a little blip at the start of the stream, but it's not bad enough that I care. And the point here is like, so it's not worth it to Google to invest in getting rid of that blip, right? And so one thought I have is like, oh, do we, you know, build up some sort of music streaming service? And I'm like, well, there's not really a need for another one. It'd be kind of cool if like this was actually something that was interesting and usable. And so the current thinking that I am really attracted to, because it would involve both things like, you know, registration type pages, but also streaming type services. And this is coming out of like shelter at home, shelter in place, and, you know, like Zoom chats with family and playing video game or drawing games with them, wherein, I don't know about you all, but like my parents, every time we have this call, I have to coach them through how to make the Zoom window not be maximized so they can make it take up half the screen so that they can show the Drawosaurus game on the other half of the screen. And so I have this idea that it would be really cool to have you know, a web application that you send out as a simple link, sort of like bit.ly style, and someone clicks it, and whoever the host is can, you know, now I'm hosting a video chat, and I can say, here's the game that we're going to play today. And when I'm ready, after we were all done saying like, hey, what have you been up to since last week? I can push the button and it'll like push out to you the resizing of the window, you know, or the chat pane and loading of the game, right? So stuff that folks like my parents, you know, I don't have to explain that to them anymore. And, you know, this would all be based on existing open source technology for the video chats and so forth. And I think that might be a really interesting, something like that would be a really interesting project to build that would prove out all of these like platform and microservices type capabilities. That's what I'm sort of building toward.
Nice. So my background comes from consulting previously. I left that about 3 years ago now, but I often as a consultant, you get kept in arm's distance from anything kind of production oriented. Like I don't know why they do that. They pay you a lot of money to stay away from the things that can be really helpful. But yeah, and so I was always really hungry to get access to using data at scale and like seeing that kind of tooling at use. And so that's definitely one thing I'm curious about with how you would make, if you would be making that kind of visible and accessible for people to explore, and if so, how, and that kind of stuff. So I'll definitely follow along if you're sharing that around Twitter and Slack and whatnot.
Yeah, great. Happy to share. To linger on this a little longer, I can, still not representing VMware here, but you can, during some period of my time right now, if I were to build this thing and have it say publishing to monitoring systems or observability systems like with Prometheus and Grafana, or alternatively to Wavefront, which is within VMware, my teams are going to be fine with that. But if I were publishing to some competitor, they might not be so happy. But if it were open source and somebody else were to come along and say, well, I want to publish to Datadog or whatever, then, that's fine.
That is completely fair. I built something much smaller scale just to try and fill the gap that I had had years ago for people. That is like just an image manipulation little app that you can run with a Docker Compose file. So it's not even in Kubernetes; it's just Docker Compose, and but it is very heavily instrumented for what it does so that people can at least like get to the user interfaces and stuff. And it's mostly all open source, so yeah. But that's cool.
Nice.
I would love to use Wavefront. I've seen it. I haven't played with it myself, so I'm totally okay with that being the first tool.
Nice. And if anybody else here, wants to say like, oh, let's figure out how to define SLOs in Noble 9, then that seems like a pretty good idea as well.
Yeah, why not? All right. Any other questions?
How are we on time?
We're right on the official time. We're probably about ready to wrap it up, unless you have something you want to say.
Well, one tiny little question for Corey then. So Corey, you mentioned proxies and sidecars is a great way to sort of get going with this without having to dive into a bunch of stuff. In my mind, immediately, I thought of like API information and the headers that are returned by APIs, and then also structured log data, and there's a whole topic there. But what else should be in that list? What did I miss?
In the list of
things that proxies and sidecars can pay attention to.
Oh, sure. I guess the thing that was exciting to me about that is like you could define, as code, define your rules around like how do you measure latency or success for this particular service, and adjacently define how are we defining what's our objective, at what point are we crossing the threshold around this being too slow or having too many errors, and publish that, or have it queryable or publishable to your alerting system, your monitoring system, from something like a sidecar. So like adjacent to the thing that's actually providing the service without having to instrument the thing that's actually providing the service. This is what, I don't know if this is answering your question, but that's the point that I'm really excited about, is like in terms of getting started, we can bring up something that has like this encapsulated purpose, and later come back and say like, okay, next I want to go further into instrumenting my code to make sure I'm moving from raw unstructured logs to structured event logs, and adding publishing to Wavefront or etc., those kinds of things. Is that answering the question?
Yeah, that gives me some more ideas.
It's really like I want to find ways. The other thing I didn't cover, I don't think, very well in this talk is, this is an aspect of making it easier for people to get started. And if we can lower the barrier to entry, then we can increase adoption. Other you know, in the API space, like the Open API Swagger kind of thing, is a set of tools that make it easier for someone to publish their APIs and to generate the SDKs or whatever to get going. And therefore teams are embracing, you know, sort of like conventions around API development more. So really trying to find that kind of thing. What are the ways that we can make it easier for people to see the value? Oh, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I'll frame it this way too. Like unit tests, I suspect that the degree to which people were unit testing and test driving their code went up substantially once it was easy to put test harnesses and frameworks in place and to integrate them into CI pipelines. Once you see that value with low overhead, then all of a sudden we see this explosion of people adopting those practices, and that's what we need.
Well,
thanks for asking.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Corey, for your talks today. Very cool. Thanks to everybody for being here, for sticking it out to the end. And bring a friend next time, fill out the survey, and we'll see you soon. See you in the Slack channel.
Thanks all.